I traded 40 years of my life for a 3-year lie that cost me exactly $349,700. 3 years ago, I landed in Cebu as a king with a fortune. Today, I'm a ghost in a windowless room, staring at a bank balance of exactly $300, wondering how a lifetime of savings vanished in the blink of an eye. Before I show you exactly how they set the trap and reveal the brutal reality behind the hero script, make sure to subscribe to the channel. You need to hear this story before you book your flight, because the paradise you're chasing might just be the most expensive prison you'll ever enter. Now, I'm just a ghost in the city I once thought I owned, watching the woman I loved move her cousin, who I now realize was her actual boyfriend, into the bedroom I furnished. My dignity is gone, and the paradise I bought feels more like a prison every day. I'm telling you this because I don't want you to end up like me, broken and waiting for a humiliating flight back to a country where I have nothing left. It feels like I've been living in a waiting room for death, and the most terrifying part is realizing how they set the trap. It all started so perfectly, with a smile that made me forget everything. Before I ever stepped foot in Cebu, my life was a series of gray corridors and fluorescent lights that drained the color from my skin. I spent 30 years as a mid-level manager for a logistics firm in a town where the rain always felt colder than it should. Every morning was a mechanical ritual, the same burnt coffee, the same congested commute, and the same stack of invoices. I was a ghost in a cubicle, a cog in a machine that wouldn't skip a beat if I vanished. It was a life of quiet desperation where my only contribution was being a reliable line item on a corporate spreadsheet. Then came the divorce, which happened with a weary, silent sigh that left me echoing in a 4-bedroom house that felt like a museum of failed expectations. After 24 years, my wife looked through me like furniture she'd grown tired of dusting. When she left, she took the energy and half the retirement fund I'd spent my youth building. I was left sitting in a recliner, eating frozen dinners in front of a television that provided the only voice I heard for days. The silence was heavy, a thick layer of dust settling on my soul as I realized I was utterly alone. In my home country, a man of my age becomes invisible the moment he stops being productive. At the grocery store, young women looked right past me, their eyes sliding over my face as if I were part of the background architecture. I felt like I was already dead, just waiting for my body to get the memo. My existence had become a stolid waiting room for death, a sterile and colorless space where the only thing to look forward to was a lower heating bill or a doctor's appointment. There was no passion, no heat, and no hope that my remaining chapters would be a slow fade. I looked at my remaining $350,000, the half I managed to keep, and realized it wasn't enough to be rich in America, but just enough to be comfortable while I rotted away. I was terrified of the winter, rising insurance costs, and neighbors who only spoke to complain about my grass. Every day was a carbon copy of the one before, a loop of mediocrity that felt like a life sentence. I was starving for something real, for a reason to wake up that didn't involve checking my blood pressure or staring at a gray sky that never seemed to break. That was when I started spending nights on the internet, scrolling through photos of turquoise water and white sand that looked like another planet. I saw videos of men who looked just like me, tired and forgotten, walking with beautiful women who looked at them with genuine adoration. It felt like a door opening, leading to a world where my age was an asset and my savings could buy a second youth. I told myself I didn't have to stay in this waiting room for death. I could choose to live again in paradise. I had no idea that I was already picking out the girl who would destroy me. It started with a late-night search, a desperate click in the dark of my silent living room that changed everything. I found these videos of guys who looked just like me, tired, graying, and utterly overlooked. but they were smiling under palm trees and sipping cold beers. They spoke of a land where a modest pension turned you into a local celebrity, and where loneliness was a choice, not a life sentence. It felt like finding a shimmering oasis in the middle of my scorched earth existence. I watched hours of footage of Mactan and Cebu, convinced that my savings weren't just money, but a golden ticket to a life I didn't have to earn, but simply claim. The math was intoxicating, and in my desperate state, it seemed completely bulletproof. I saw spreadsheets and testimonials claiming I could live like a prince for $2,000 a month, including a private driver and a chef. In Ohio, that barely covered taxes and insurance, but in the Philippines, I would be a tycoon. I started reading about Filipino hospitality and the deep-rooted family values that supposedly made their women more loyal than any I had ever known. It wasn't just about money, it was the promise of being respected again. I was ready to trade my isolation for a culture that supposedly honored its seniors. I spent weeks in a fever dream of planning, my heart beating with a rhythm I hadn't felt since my 20s. I started selling off the heavy furniture, the lawnmower, and the ghosts of my old life, each sale bringing me closer to the sun. The gray corridors of my office didn't seem so oppressive because I knew I was a short-timer, a man with a secret escape hatch. I felt like a prisoner who had finally found the blueprints to the warden's office. I wasn't just moving, I was marching toward that oasis, convinced the air would carry the scent of jasmine instead of regret. Then I did what every lonely man with a passport does. I signed up for a Filipino dating site. The moment my profile went live, my inbox exploded with notifications that felt like shots of pure adrenaline. Beautiful young women from Cebu and Manila were messaging me, telling me I looked handsome and kind-hearted. After years of being invisible in my own grocery store, this sudden flood of attention was a drug I didn't know I was addicted to. I ignored the warnings about scammers because I wanted to believe I was the exception. I wanted to believe that these women saw the real me beneath the wrinkles. Amidst the hundreds of profiles, one stood out, a woman with a smile so bright it made my laptop screen feel like a window to another dimension. Her name was Christine, and her eyes held a softness that promised a peace I hadn't known in decades. She didn't ask about my bank account. She asked if I liked the sunset and if I was lonely. My hands were shaking as I typed my first response, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I felt like I was reaching across the ocean to grab a lifeline. I hit send, and within minutes, the notification chime signaled the beginning of my end. When I finally stepped out of the sliding glass doors at Mactan Cebu International Airport, the heat hit me like a physical weight. But it was a warm, welcoming embrace compared to the sterile air conditioning of the plane. There she was, standing near the railing, with a hand-painted sign that simply said, "Frank," with a little heart next to it. Christine looked even more radiant than she did on the grainy Skype calls, her skin glowing under the terminal lights, and her smile wide enough to make me forget every bitter winter I'd ever endured. In that moment, the $350,000 in my bank account felt like an infinite mountain of gold, and I was the conquering hero arriving to claim his prize. I felt like I had finally stepped out of a black and white movie and into a world of saturated, vibrant Technicolor. We took a white taxi toward the city, and as we crawled through the chaotic, buzzing traffic of Mactan, she never let go of my hand. She kept leaning her head on my shoulder, whispering how handsome I looked in person, and how she couldn't believe I was actually there. I was 57, but under her gaze, the wrinkles around my eyes seemed to vanish, and the heaviness in my chest evaporated. I wasn't the reliable logistics manager anymore. I was a man of mystery, a benefactor, a king who had crossed the ocean for love. The scent of her perfume mixed with the humid air and the smell of street food, creating an intoxicating cocktail that went straight to my head. I was already high on the idea of being wanted, completely oblivious to the fact that I was walking into a beautifully choreographed performance. That first week in Cebu was a blur of expensive dinners at the IT park and sunset drinks where I never once looked at the price on the menu. We stayed at a high-end hotel where the staff treated me with a level of deference I had never experienced in my entire life in Ohio. Every time I reached for my leather wallet to peel off a few thousand peso notes, Christine would give a little bashful protest, telling me I was too generous, which only made me want to spend more. It felt like I was playing the lead role in the most perfect romantic script ever written, where every scene was designed to validate my ego and soothe my lonely soul. I was the director, the star, and the financier of a fantasy that I desperately needed to be true. The physical attention was something I hadn't prepared for after years of a cold, silent marriage. Christine was constantly touching my arm, fixing my collar, or leaning in to share a secret laugh that made me feel like we were the only two people in the entire city. In the United States, I was a ghost, a man whose expiration date was rapidly approaching. But here, I was the center of the universe. I remember sitting at a rooftop bar overlooking the city lights, feeling her hand on my knee, and thinking that I had finally cheated the system. I had found the shortcut to happiness that all those other guys back home were too afraid to take. I was convinced that my life had finally begun at 57, and the gray corridors of my past were nothing but a bad dream I had finally woken up from. One afternoon, we took a trip to a local mall, and I insisted on buying her a new phone and several dresses because I wanted her to look as beautiful as she made me feel. The joy on her face when I handed over my credit card was like a shot of pure dopamine. It felt incredible to have the power to change someone's life with just a signature. She told me I was her white knight, the man who had come to rescue her from a life of struggle, and I swallowed that lie like it was the finest champagne. I didn't see the transaction, I only saw the gratitude, and my ego feasted on it until I was completely blind to the reality of our dynamic. I was addicted to being the hero, and she was an expert at playing the damsel in distress who only needed a little financial support to keep smiling. The cost of living was so incredibly low that I felt like my savings would last 3 lifetimes, which made me even more reckless with my communal resources. A massive seafood feast that would have cost me $200 in Chicago was barely $40 here, including the drinks and the tip. I felt like a tycoon, a man whose wealth was so vast it couldn't be depleted by these micro-transactions of happiness. I started thinking about the guys I knew back home, still grinding away at jobs they hated, and I felt a surge of arrogant pity for them. They were still in the waiting room for death, while I was out here living a life of luxury with a woman who treated me like a god. I was so busy counting my blessings that I didn't notice I was actually counting down the days until my liquidation. A few days later, Christine suggested we take a trip to her provincia, the rural village where she grew up, so I could meet her mother and siblings. I was touched by the gesture, seeing it as a sign of deep commitment and cultural integration, rather than the tactical move it actually was. We hired a private van, which I paid for, of course, and drove for hours into the lush green mountains of Cebu. When we arrived, the entire family was waiting, and they welcomed me with a warmth that felt more genuine than anything I'd experienced in decades. They called me Sir Frank with such respect that I felt a lump in my throat, convinced that I had finally found a real family who valued me for more than just my productivity. That evening, we sat outside on plastic chairs under a canopy of stars that seemed brighter than any I had ever seen in the Midwest. I bought 2 cases of San Miguel beer for the men and a massive spread of food for the children, and for a few hours, I was the most important person in that village. Christine's mother sat next to me, holding my hand and thanking me through tears for taking care of her daughter. I felt a profound sense of purpose, a belief that my $350,000 weren't just for my retirement, but were meant to be the foundation for this entire family's future. I wasn't just a retiree. I was a provider, a patriarch, and a savior who had finally found where he belonged. In my mind, I was building a legacy, a story of a man who found love in the autumn of his life and used his success to lift up those less fortunate. I started making mental notes of all the things I could do for them: fixing the roof of their modest home, buying a motorcycle for the brother, ensuring the younger sisters finished school. Each thought of help was a brick in the wall of my own prison, but at the time it felt like I was paving a road to paradise. I was so caught up in the hero script that I didn't realize I was the only one who didn't know how the play ended. I was the benefactor of a tragedy I was too happy to read, convinced that my love was the currency that kept the world spinning. Christine's affection never wavered. If anything, she became even more attentive once I started talking about the dream house we would build together. She would sit with me for hours, scrolling through photos of Mediterranean villas and modern tropical designs, her eyes wide with a simulated wonder that I mistook for shared ambition. We talked about a garden with hibiscus flowers and a balcony where we would watch the sun dip into the ocean every single night for the rest of our lives. It was a beautiful, shimmering mirage, and I was so thirsty for it that I didn't care if it was made of sand. I was ready to sign anything, buy anything, and promise anything to keep that vision alive because the alternative, the gray life back in Ohio, was too terrifying to contemplate. I truly believed I was the exception to every rule I'd ever heard about older men moving to the Philippines for young wives. I told myself that Christine was different, that our connection was spiritual and intellectual, and that she saw the real me that everyone else had ignored for years. I looked at the other expats I saw in the malls, the ones who looked disheveled and miserable, and I told myself that they just didn't know how to treat a woman right. I was arrogant in my happiness, convinced that my wealth was a shield and my love was a bond that could never be broken by something as vulgar as money. I was living in a dream so deep that I had forgotten what it felt like to be awake. Looking back at those first few months, I can see the script so clearly now. Every smile a cue, and every emergency a carefully timed plot point. It was the most expensive and convincing theater performance I have ever attended, and I was the only person in the audience who didn't know the actors were just waiting for the curtain to fall. I felt like a king on a throne of gold, never realizing that the gold was melting under the tropical sun, and the throne was made of nothing but debt and deception. I was so convinced that I had found my forever that I ignored every red flag that fluttered in the breeze. Looking back, I should have realized that everything was just a little too perfect to be real, but at the time, I simply didn't want to see it. The transition from the honeymoon phase didn't happen with a scream, but with a whisper, a tiny, flickering shadow of doubt that I quickly smothered with my own arrogance. I viewed my $350,000 as a vast, shimmering reservoir of security, a deep lake that could never possibly run dry under the tropical sun. When Christine first mentioned that her younger sister couldn't afford her school fees for the upcoming semester, I didn't see a red flag. I saw a chance to be the benevolent provider I had always dreamed of being. It was only $100, a mere drop from my massive reservoir, and the way Christine looked at me with such tearful, breathless gratitude made me feel like I was truly changing a life. I told myself that a real man protects his family's future, and I was more than happy to play the role of the savior for such a trivial price. A few weeks later, the reservoir developed its second micro-fissure, when Christine's mother suddenly fell ill with a mysterious respiratory infection that required expensive imported medicine. Christine was inconsolable, sobbing into my chest about how helpless she felt living in poverty while her mother suffered in the village. I immediately handed over $250, convinced that my wealth was a tool meant for this exact purpose, to act as a shield against the cruelties of a third world reality. I rationalized the expense by telling myself that filial piety was the cornerstone of Filipino culture, and by supporting her mother, I was proving my worth as a serious, committed partner. I was so addicted to the white knight high that I didn't notice how quickly her tears vanished once the cash was safely tucked into her purse, leaving me feeling like a hero in a play I was paying to produce. The requests began to gain a rhythmic quality, a steady drip, drip, drip of financial emergencies that always seemed to coincide with our weekend plans. Her brother, the one I had shared beers with under the stars, supposedly had his motorcycle, his only source of income, seized by a predatory lender over a small debt. It was $400 to get it back, and Christine framed it as a strategic investment in the family's self-sufficiency, promising me that he would never ask for help again once he was back on the road. I felt a surge of patriarchal pride as I counted out the bills, viewing myself as the CEO of this family's survival strategy rather than a target for liquidation. I convinced myself that I wasn't just spending money, I was building a foundation of utang na loob, a debt of gratitude that would ensure their loyalty to me forever. When a tropical depression swept through the region, a small leak in the family's nipa hut roof suddenly became a catastrophic structural failure that threatened to destroy all their belongings. Christine showed me photos of a damp floor and a worried-looking grandmother, her eyes pleading for a miracle that only my bank account could provide. $800 was all it took to fix the problem and upgrade the roof to corrugated metal, a price I paid with a sense of weary, defensive satisfaction. I told myself that it was my duty to ensure my new family lived in dignity, ignoring the fact that the reservoir's level was dropping faster than I had ever anticipated. I was still operating on the logic of Ohio, where $800 is a car payment, but in Cebu, I was effectively funding a village renovation project, one crisis at a time. I began to feel a strange, creeping anxiety every time Christine's phone chimed with a message from her family, but I suppressed it by doubling down on my role as the generous benefactor. When she suggested a massive family celebration for her mother's birthday, a pasalamat to thank God for my arrival in their lives, I spent $600 on catering and drinks without blinking. I rationalized it as social capital, a way to cement my status in the community so that I would always be respected and protected in this foreign land. I was buying their smiles and their Sir Frank salutations, unaware that I was merely paying the interest on an emotional ransom that would only continue to grow. I felt like a king distributing gold to his subjects, too blinded by the ceremony to realize that the gold was my only remaining defense against a looming, silent poverty. The sick buffalo script finally made its grand appearance when a distant cousin allegedly needed emergency surgery after a horrific accident that the family couldn't possibly afford. The price tag was $1,500, a significant jump from the previous microtransactions, and for the first time, I felt a genuine cold shiver of hesitation in my soul. Christine didn't pressure me. Instead, she became quiet and withdrawn, her love replaced by a heavy, mournful silence that made the house feel like a tomb. I couldn't handle the withdrawal of her affection, the sudden loss of the hero script that had become my new identity, so I signed the check just to bring back her scripted smile. I told myself that $1,500 was nothing compared to the $350,000 I started with, a drop in an ocean that I still believed was bottomless. As the months rolled on, I noticed a subtle but undeniable shift in the atmosphere of our relationship. Christine was less attentive to my needs and more focused on the needs of her sprawling network of relatives. Our conversations, once filled with romantic dreams of sunsets and travel, were now dominated by discussions of hospital bills, tuition arrears, and bail money for various misunderstandings. I felt like I was being audited by a board of directors who only saw me as a quarterly dividend check that they were entitled to harvest. I rationalized her change in demeanor as stress from her family's constant demands, convincing myself that if I could just solve their problems, she would return to the woman I first met. I was paying for the ghost of a honeymoon, a phantom of affection that was becoming increasingly expensive to maintain in the humid heat of Cebu. Then came the legal emergency, a complex land dispute involving her family's ancestral property that required $2,000 to grease the wheels of the local bureaucracy. Christine explained the system to me with such conviction, the corruption, the fees, the need for a strong man to protect their heritage, that I felt a surge of protective masculine energy. I saw myself as the enlightened Westerner navigating a primitive system to save his beloved's birthright, a role that fed my ego even as it drained my capital. I told myself that securing this land was an investment in our future, a way to have a backup if our other plans failed, completely ignoring the rule of law in the Philippines. I was throwing money into a legal black hole, convinced that my generosity would eventually be rewarded with a stability that money can't buy, but only rents. For Christine's 23rd birthday, I felt a desperate need to prove that my wealth was still infinite and that I was still the white knight she had fallen for. I spent $3,000 on a party that would have been the talk of the town back in Ohio, complete with a live band, a whole lechon, and gifts for every member of her extended family. I watched her dance and laugh with people I barely knew, feeling a hollow ache in my chest as I realized I was the only person in the room who wasn't truly enjoying themselves. I justified the cost by telling myself that she deserved one day of pure, unadulterated joy after a life of struggle, even as a small voice in the back of my mind screamed that the reservoir was now dangerously low. I was a man clinging to a sinking ship, convinced that if I just painted the deck gold, it would somehow stay afloat. When her brother approached me with a business opportunity to start a Sorry Sorry store for $4,000, I grabbed onto the idea like a drowning man grabs a life raft. I told myself that if they had their own income, the emergencies would finally stop, and I could return to my quiet, peaceful retirement with Christine. It was a strategic move, I argued with myself, a way to buy back my own peace of mind by funding their independence once and for all. I ignored the fact that I knew nothing about the local retail market or the brothers' actual work ethic, focusing instead on the fantasy of a closed payroll. I was so eager to fix the leaks in the dam that I didn't see the massive structural cracks forming beneath the waterline, convinced that one final big check would solve everything. The most terrifying part of this phase was the realization that my power of no had completely evaporated, replaced by a paralyzing fear of being alone in a foreign country. If I refused a request, Christine's eyes would turn cold, her touch would become mechanical, and the paradise I had bought would suddenly feel like a humid, lonely prison. I was paying for the performance of love, a monthly subscription fee that I was terrified of letting expire because I had nowhere else to go and no one else to turn to. I rationalized my submission as cultural adaptation, telling myself that this was just how things worked in the Philippines and that I had to be flexible to survive. I was a high-paying tenant on a rented throne, desperately trying to ignore the fact that the landlord was already looking for my replacement. By the end of my first year, the reservoir that I thought would last 30 years was already showing the rocky floor beneath the shimmering surface, but I was too deep in denial to stop. I had spent nearly $60,000 on emergencies, investments, and celebrations, but I told myself I still had nearly $300,000 left, which was plenty for the big project. Christine started talking about the house, the Mediterranean villa on the hill we had dreamed about during our first weeks, and her eyes regained that shimmering, magical glow I had missed so much. She told me that once we had our own home, we could finally move away from the village and start our real life together, free from the demands of her relatives. I felt a surge of renewed hope, a belief that this was the final piece of the puzzle. But I had no idea that the house was the ultimate trap, and the construction was about to begin. "Frank, imagine our children playing in a garden where no one ever asks for money," she whispered, her voice a velvet trap that promised an end to the bleeding. We were sitting on a rented balcony, and the constant emergencies from her village were starting to feel like a slow-motion car crash I couldn't steer away from. She proposed the ultimate solution. We would build our own sanctuary, a Mediterranean villa in the hills of Busey, far away from the grasping hands of her relatives. It was framed as the final investment, the one that would turn off the ATM and start our real life. I felt a surge of desperate relief, believing that a house of stone could finally anchor my drifting, lonely soul. The legal reality was a jagged pill I swallowed with a smile, convinced I was the exception to every cautionary tale I had ever heard. Since I couldn't own land in the Philippines, the title would be in Christine's name, a detail she presented as a testament to my total trust in our forever. I looked at Section 7, Article 12 of their Constitution and saw a barrier, but she saw a bridge of love that only a real man would cross. I rationalized that her name on the document was just a formality, a youth surcharge I was willing to pay to secure my position as the undisputed king of her heart. I was handing her the keys to my own cage. I started doing the Ohio math, a dangerous mental game that made a $180,000 investment look like a bargain compared to the life I had left behind. Back home, that kind of money wouldn't buy a parking spot in a decent neighborhood, but here it promised a palace with a view of the Bohol Sea. I saw the blueprints, grand arches, infinity pools, and marble floors, and I felt like a tycoon rather than a mark. My savings were no longer a safety net. They were raw materials for a monument to my own ego. I was blinded by the scale of the deal, forgetting that a bargain is only a bargain if you actually get to keep what you buy. The construction became a fever dream of white knight validation as I spent my days watching local workers lay bricks I had paid for with 40 years of sweat. I felt like a patriarch, a savior who was lifting Christine out of the mud and into a life of luxury she never could have imagined. Every time I authorized a new payment for imported tiles or premium wiring, the village elders would bow lower, calling me Sir Frank with a reverence that tasted like nectar. I was so addicted to the ceremony of being the benefactor that I didn't notice the board of directors was already planning my retirement from my own property. As the house rose from the red earth, my bank account began to hemorrhage in large, terrifying chunks that kept me awake in the humid nights. The microtransactions had evolved into massive structural invoices, and the sick buffalo had been replaced by supply chain delays and permit greasing. I was sprinting toward the finish line, convinced that once the roof was on, the peace would finally begin. My anxiety was a vibrating wire in my chest, but I masked it with a forced, manic confidence. I told myself that this was the leap of faith all great men take, jumping off the cliff and waiting for the wings to sprout. The day finally came for the big transfer, $200,000 to finalize the construction and secure the remaining materials. I sat in front of my laptop, the cursor hovering over the confirm button of my U.S. Bank's international wire portal. Christine was standing behind me, her hands massaging my shoulders, her breath warm against my neck as she whispered about our first night in the master suite. My heart was a drum, a frantic rhythm of survival and surrender. I looked at the digits, closed my eyes, and clicked send, watching a lifetime of labor vanish into the humid Cebu air with a single final notification chime. The wire transfer was still processing in the digital ether when the first crack appeared on the physical surface of my reality. We were sitting in a high-end cafe in IT Park, supposedly celebrating my investment in our future, when Christine stepped away to use the restroom, leaving her phone face up on the marble table. A notification chirped, a message from a contact saved only as Cousin June. I shouldn't have looked, but the preview text was a jagged blade that sliced through my celebratory high. Is the ATM empty yet? Tell the old white pig it's time to go home. My blood turned to ice water, my vision blurring as the air in the air-conditioned cafe suddenly felt like it was being sucked out by a vacuum. When she returned, her face was still wearing that practiced, radiant smile, but for the first time I saw the mechanics behind it, the calculated muscle movements of a predator who had just finished a long, successful hunt. I showed her the screen, my hands shaking so violently that the phone nearly clattered onto the floor. I waited for the tears, the frantic explanations about translation errors or family jokes. But the mask didn't just slip, it disintegrated. Her eyes went from warm honey to cold, dead obsidian in a heartbeat. She didn't apologize. She simply sat down, crossed her legs, and looked at me with a bored, clinical indifference that was more terrifying than any scream. "You think I love you, Frank?" she asked, her voice devoid of the sweet, melodic lilt she'd used for 3 years. It was flat, transactional, and brutal. She explained that June wasn't her cousin, but her partner of 7 years, the man who had helped her script every emergency and sick buffalo story I had ever funded. They had been treating my $350,000 like a communal harvest, a slow-motion lottery win that they had finally fully liquidated with that last $200,000 wire. Every "I love you" had a price tag I had been too arrogant to see, and now that the vault was empty, the performance was officially over. I threatened to call the police, to sue her, to take the house back, but she just laughed, a sharp, metallic sound that echoed off the expensive walls I had paid for. She reminded me with a cruel, mocking precision about the Philippine Constitution and the title I had so proudly put in her name. I wasn't a homeowner. I was a guest who had overstayed his financial welcome. The legal documents I had signed in a haze of romantic ego were now the bars of my own prison. I realized with a sickening jolt that I had spent 40 years of hard work to buy a palace for a man I had never met, while I was being evicted from my own life. We drove back to the house in a silence so heavy it felt like it would crush the car. But when we arrived, the cousin was already there, standing on the balcony of my master suite. He wasn't hiding anymore. He was wearing one of the expensive linen shirts I'd bought at the mall, leaning against the marble railing with a proprietary ease that made my stomach heave. He didn't look like a relative. He looked like the owner. Christine didn't even look at me as she walked toward him, her entire posture changing as she leaned into him with a genuine affection she had never truly shown me. I was the ghost in the foyer, the financier of their happily ever after. I looked past her and saw my 2 suitcases sitting on the dirt outside the gate, looking like 2 small tombstones for my former life. Christine didn't look back as she walked into the house, her hand sliding naturally into the grip of the man who was already pouring a glass of the expensive whiskey I had bought to celebrate our move-in. The heavy mahogany front door, the one I had insisted be reinforced for our security, swung shut with a deafening final thud. I stood alone in the heat, staring at the brass nameplate on the gate that now only displayed her family name. The lock turned with a sharp, mechanical click that signaled the end of my existence. Standing in the humid dirt, I felt like a shipwreck survivor watching his vessel slip beneath the waves from a barren shore. The mahogany door I'd paid $5,000 for remained shut, a silent monument to my own stupidity. Inside, the man I'd funded was sleeping in my sheets, drinking my whiskey, and laughing with the woman I thought was my soulmate. I looked at my 2 battered suitcases, the only remains of a 40-year career, and felt a hollow, vibrating ache in my chest. I wasn't a king anymore. I was just a piece of human debris discarded by the tide. The transition from Sir Frank to a nameless, invisible ghost happened with a brutal clinical speed. As I walked toward the main road, the neighbors who once bowed and smiled now looked through me as if I were made of glass. The children I'd bought toys for retreated into their homes, their mothers pulling them back from the poor foreigner who no longer had any candy or coins to distribute. I realized then that my presence in this village had never been about me. I was merely a temporary weather pattern of wealth that had finally passed, leaving nothing but dry earth. I sat in a plastic chair at a terminal-side eatery, staring at the glowing screen of my phone one last time. $300. That was the total valuation of my life after 4 decades of logistics management and 36 months of paradise. My retirement wasn't a golden sunset. It was a cold, empty room in a house I could never enter again. I felt a profound sense of impotence, a realization that I had signed away my own survival for the scripted affection of a predator. I was a man who had traded his future for a series of expensive, choreographed lies. The taxi ride to Mactan Airport was a grueling, silent funeral procession through the neon-lit chaos of a city that had successfully liquidated me. I watched the luxury malls and the high-end hotels slide past the window, remembering the arrogant tycoon I had been just 3 years ago. Every palm tree and sunset now felt like a taunt, a reminder of the mirage I had chased into the desert. I arrived at the terminal not as a conquering hero, but as a defeated prisoner of war, carrying nothing but the heavy, suffocating weight of my own humiliation and a one-way ticket to a cold, gray reality. Standing at the departure gate, I looked at the same sliding glass doors where I had first seen Christine's sign. The contrast was a jagged blade in my heart. I arrived with a mountain of gold and a heart full of hope, and I was leaving as a broken man with a hollow soul. If you're thinking about retiring to the Philippines, look at my face and remember the cost of the hero script. Don't let your ego be the architect of your own prison. Keep your heart open, but for God's sake, keep your vault locked, because once the ATM is empty, the love story is over. If you are sitting in your living room right now, looking at photos of turquoise water and dreaming of a young woman who finally understands you, I am the voice from your future that you must hear. I am not a hater. I am a lighthouse built on the jagged rocks of my own shipwreck, and I am shining my light to warn you away from the reef that tore my life apart. Let me ask you one thing. If you didn't have that bank balance, would she even look at you? If the answer is no, then every I love you is a scripted transaction. Understand the blood money rules before you pack your bags. In Cebu, your savings aren't private property. They are a communal resource that hasn't been distributed yet. You are not a husband. You are the CEO of an infinite payroll for a village that sees you as a lottery ticket. Remember rule number 1. Section 7, Article 12 of the Philippine Constitution means you will never own the land you build on. You are merely a high-paying tenant on a rented throne, and the moment you stop paying for every sick buffalo or school fee, the performance ends and the locks are changed. Don't fall for the Social Security trap door, thinking you can live on $1,000 a month once the savings vanish. In this culture, an empty ATM is a ghost, and a broke foreigner is just a punchline for the locals. Keep your heart open, but for God's sake, keep your vault locked and your capital in a Western bank. If you want to avoid being the old white pig sitting on a suitcase in the dirt, you must learn the power of no. I traded 40 years of work for 3 years of lies. Don't let my ending be your beginning. Protect your legacy.